The warmth enveloped the residence much like a dense, quiet haze, oppressive and stagnant. Every dawn commenced identically, his tread along the corridor, the subdued whir of the coffee maker, a fleeting sorrow devoid of shared glances. His kindness never waned, therein lay the issue. No obvious break existed, nothing definitive to identify and declare, "This is the reason I feel so overlooked." He continued to prepare my Sunday breakfast, still inquired about my sleep, yet never initiated physical contact, not purposefully, not with yearning. I had transformed into the backdrop of our existence, always there, recognizable, but no longer truly seen. I had ceased wearing my customary cotton sleepwear in the nighttime, opting instead for garments more delicate, more supple, occasionally even transparent. It was absurd, I conceded to myself, yet it offered me a measure of influence, a faint trace of self-regard. I would apply fragrance merely to recline alone on the veranda and tend to the plants, just to experience the chill of the glass against my skin. It wasn't for his benefit, I wasn't certain it was even for my own. It felt more like an ingrained habit, a ceremony from a former existence. The arrangement was for his arrival the following week, that was the understanding, or at least what my spouse had conveyed. A brief summer stay, a couple of weeks before the academic term commenced. I hadn't pondered it extensively. In my recollection, he remained a youth, lanky, courteous, reserved around grown-ups. I was shoeless, clad in my dressing gown, taking the laundry hamper to the clothesline when the sound of an automobile reached me. The grind of tires on the drive cut through the oppressive heat. I wasn't anticipating anyone. I narrowed my eyes against the sun's brightness, shading them with a hand, and then I observed him exit the vehicle. He shut the car door unhurriedly, like one who was already at home here. Taller, more broad-shouldered, his facial features now more defined, sharper, yet his eyes were undeniably his. And the manner in which they rested on me, direct, serene, not the gaze of a youngster greeting an older person. It disquieted me more than I cared to acknowledge. I felt exposed, genuinely bare for the initial time in many years. The silk of the robe adhered to the curve of my thigh where the zephyr passed. His look didn't waver, didn't shift away due to awkwardness or deference. It persisted, it appraised, not disrespectfully, but with conviction. He grinned as he drew near, letting his luggage fall to the porch with a gentle thud. "I'm ahead of schedule," he stated, as if it were deliberate. I inclined my head, struggling to strike a vocal tone that wasn't overly stiff or excessively friendly. He surveyed the yard, as though examining a distant recollection. "Everything appears smaller than I recall," he commented, "except for the sunlight. That remains unchanged." And just like that, I remembered his capacity for quietness, his ease and stillness. He didn't hasten to occupy the void, he paused. And I became aware I had no notion of how to comport myself, no idea what to utter next. My heart wasn't pounding, it was a slower, more profound sensation, like the initial stirring of the ground preceding a torrent of earth. I bid him enter, moving aside as he passed. The atmosphere within the house altered upon his entry, warmer, weightier, not due to the ambient temperature, but from the imminence of something unforeseeable. My husband was due home in 2 hours. Until then, it was merely the two of us in a dwelling too confined for secrets. I observed him proceed down the hallway with a sort of self-possession I hadn't witnessed in ages, and for an instant, I wished the robe had been even more revealing. Yet, I maintained to myself he was simply a visitor, merely kin. This was nothing beyond an odd occurrence in the sunshine. But when he glanced back over his shoulder and smiled once more, there was an element in it that was not of the past, and I understood, whether I desired it or not, that something new had commenced. The subsequent morning started in the same way, but the air felt changed, as if the house itself had registered the transformation. My husband departed early for a supply acquisition, murmuring about the heatwave and wanting to beat the rush at the hardware supplier. I nodded from the kitchen table, still in my robe, my fingers encircling a mug that had long gone cold. He materialized behind me silently, barefoot, his shirt slightly wrinkled from slumber. "I was about to prepare coffee," he announced, reaching for the container on the uppermost shelf. I rose without deliberation, brushing against him to retrieve it. Our fingers touched on the lid. The instant was brief, it shouldn't have held any significance. But his hand remained, and mine did as well. I looked upwards, and he was already observing me, not with uncertainty or bewilderment, but with that same collectedness, the kind that makes it difficult to discern his thoughts. Only this time, I didn't wish to know, I wished to feel. "Allow me," he uttered softly, his voice too near. I released the container. He didn't retreat. I could perceive the scent of his skin, that subtle fusion of perspiration, laundry detergent, and something else, something youthful, electric, and perilous. I turned towards the casement window, feigning preoccupation with the garden, though my heart hammered rapidly against my ribs. I hadn't anticipated the silence to pervade the room so thoroughly. The kettle clicked off behind us, yet neither of us stirred. "I've always favored this kitchen," he remarked suddenly. "It feels as though time decelerates in here." "It does," I whispered, sometimes excessively. There was no smile, no laughter, just the gravity of the words hanging between us like the dampness outdoors. He moved closer. I could sense the heat from his chest near my shoulder, not touching, just present, like an unasked question to which he already possessed the answer. Then, without preamble, without formality, he kissed me. It wasn't tentative or unsure, it was definite, rooted in something he had evidently already contemplated. It didn't seek consent, and I didn't offer it. I didn't pull away. His mouth on mine was gentle yet firm, a silent assertion. My body grew taut, then relaxed, not in capitulation, but from a peculiar, long-lost sense of relief. When it concluded, we remained silent. He regarded me, awaiting something, remorse, a slap, a denial. But I had not to provide, only my breath, only the acute sting of consciousness surging back into my extremities. I turned away and occupied myself with the cups, my hands trembling slightly as I poured. He leaned on the counter, watching me with an inscrutable composure. "Do you regret it already?" he inquired. I shook my head without turning. "No. But I ought to." "You always adhere to what you ought to do?" "No," I replied. "That's the core of the issue." We consumed our drinks in quiet, the coffee tasting sharp and hot against my lips. My skin still throbbed where he had made contact. Nothing had altered, and yet the world beyond that window seemed more distant now, as if we had stepped behind a veil that could not be drawn back. When my husband came home, we sat at the table as customary. He inquired about the morning, and I stated we had made coffee, nothing further. But I avoided looking at either of them. I was too preoccupied with trying to commit to memory the way my lips still felt, still swollen, still claimed. And later that evening, as I disrobed alone in the bathroom, I reached for different undergarments, something of silk, black with lace across the ribs. Not for my husband, not for anyone who failed to see me. I slipped into it and examined my reflection for a prolonged period, not to critique, just to recall who I was evolving into. He found the pretext himself. My husband had mentioned the garden barrier earlier that week. One of the corners was drooping, the mesh too slack for the climbing roses. It was the sort of task he always meant to address but never quite managed. When the subject arose again during supper, the man now, offered to handle it. "I'll head into town tomorrow," he said, his voice steady. "We'll require new uprights and that green mesh from the garden emporium." My husband nodded, gratified. "Take her along," he added. "She's familiar with the type I prefer." I remained silent, merely observing the young man across the table, how calmly he sipped his water, how effortlessly he maintained an unreadable expression. The next morning, I donned denim trousers I hadn't worn in months and a cotton blouse that clung a bit too closely to my form. I departed the house with my hair still moist from the shower, a subtle hint of perfume behind my ears. He was already by the car, the passenger door ajar. The journey was quiet initially, the air conditioning unit sputtering warm air before finally succumbing to the July swelter. I lowered the window, allowing the breeze to whip strands of hair against my cheek. He glanced in my direction a few times but uttered nothing until we were almost out of the residential area. "You appear different," he remarked eventually. I looked at him. Different in what way? Lighter. Less guarded. I offered no reply. I didn't know how. There were too many possible interpretations, and none of them felt secure. We reached the Garden Emporium shortly after 10, only to discover it was temporarily shut for stock-taking. The notice on the gate indicated reopening at noon, and the parking area was nearly deserted. I instinctively reached for my mobile, but there was no reception. He shrugged. "There's a diner just a short way down the road," he suggested. "We can pass the time there." I should have declined, should have proposed we drive back, return at a later time, take separate vehicles on the next occasion. But I didn't. I followed him along the gravel verge like a woman who had already consented long before she ever voiced it. The diner was almost vacant, the whir of a ceiling fan obscuring the muted conversation of two elderly men at the counter. We selected a booth in the far corner, its vinyl seats faded by sun and age. The server brought us coffee and menus we didn't peruse. "I used to ponder about you," he said unexpectedly, gazing out the window. I blinked. "About me?" He nodded. "When I visited as a child. You were always reserved, but I could tell you were contemplating something. I just never knew what it was." I paused, my fingers clasped around my mug. "I wasn't aware you paid me any mind back then." I paid mind to everything. Especially the things no one else did. I felt the words settle in my chest like a weight, not burdensome, not painful, just undeniable. He wasn't engaging in trivial conversation, he wasn't angling for praise or feigning nostalgia. He was stating the truth. "What do you ponder now?" I inquired, my voice softer than intended. He leaned in slightly, not making contact, not near enough to breach a boundary, but close enough to make the booth feel more confined. "I ponder why you never depart from this place. Why you remain stationary when you seem like someone who has always yearned to be in motion." "I'm not a young woman any longer," I stated. "People like me don't begin anew. We persevere." "You're not elderly," he countered. "You're merely accustomed to being unobserved." His words cut through more cleanly than I anticipated, devoid of judgment, only lucidity. I wanted to object, to assert that I was content, that I had selected this existence. But a part of me recognized his correctness. I had transformed into someone whose days were molded by the choices of others, whose attractiveness had been meticulously tucked away like fine textiles, brought out only for exceptional events that never materialized. "I can't just..." I began, then faltered. "There are considerations that hold importance. Individuals who would comprehend more than you realize," he interjected. Our meal arrived, almost instantly forgotten. We picked at it without any real hunger. The heat outside had intensified into something pre-storm, thick and expectant. I didn't know if my trembling was due to him or because I had finally permitted someone to articulate what I had kept concealed for years. Back in the vehicle, we didn't converse. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, it was fraught. His hand brushed against mine once as we fastened our seatbelts. It lingered between us for a fraction too long, fingers grazing the edge of my skin like a secret daring to be revealed. When we pulled into the driveway, the sky had started to grow dim. We transported the fence posts around to the side of the house, feigning that nothing untoward had occurred. But later, as I stood alone in my bedroom, folding the shirt I had worn, I detected the faintest aroma still adhering to it, not perfume, not perspiration. Him. And I realized I didn't wish for it to be laundered away. Not just yet. The house was bustling by early afternoon. His sister had come, bearing 2 shopping bags, a floral arrangement, and a voice that invariably seemed to resonate louder than the space permitted. My husband appeared genuinely delighted to see her, which prompted me to exert a bit more effort with the wine goblets, with my smile, with feigning that I didn't feel as though something within me had become fluid and erratic. He was absent. No clarification, merely a note on the counter stating he would be away for a couple of days, scrawled beside an empty coffee cup. No indication of his destination, no time of expected return. I read the note 3 times before carefully folding it and tucking it into my apron pocket, as if it might hold significance later, as if it were a piece of evidence. She remained for luncheon and half the evening, conversing mostly with her brother about home improvements, the expense of air travel, the tomatoes in her garden. I enacted my role, laughing when appropriate, replenishing glasses, nodding at the correct junctures. But my gaze repeatedly shifted to the hallway, to the sound of vehicles outside. I caught myself checking my phone 3 times for no discernible reason. The silence he had left in his wake was distinct from the one that usually permeated the house. This one was incomplete, it pressed against my chest like a retained breath. I wore a navy blue dress that day, fitted, soft, one he hadn't seen previously. It hugged my waist, dipped slightly at the back, perhaps too formal for a family gathering, but I was unconcerned. I wasn't dressing for the sister, I wasn't even dressing for myself. I simply yearned to feel his eyes upon me again, even in his absence. That evening, after she had finally departed, my husband suggested we sit on the veranda, wine in hand, the cicadas chirping through the dusk. He settled into his chair with a sigh, content. I observed his profile in the diminishing light, contemplating how unaltered it was, how the years had settled upon him with little opposition. "You've been quiet today," he remarked unexpectedly. "I suppose I'm just weary. Too much conversation." He smiled. "She never ceases." "She certainly fills a room," I murmured. "She is adept at that." A pause ensued, not uneasy, but distinct. I thought he might elaborate, but he didn't. He merely sipped his wine and gazed into the garden. I comprehended he was still a man who operated under the belief that everything was satisfactory as long as there was no overt dispute, as long as we exchanged smiles and shared a meal, the underlying structure remained intact. Later, as I lay in bed beside him, his respiration evened out swiftly, slumber always came to him without difficulty. I stared at the ceiling, the fan casting unhurried, shifting shadows across the wall. I envisioned where he might have ventured, what he might be occupied with, not with suspicion, but with something more akin to a yearning. I walked barefoot to the guest room. It carried a faint scent of him, even now, of cedar-scented soap, something warm. I stood there in the dimness, arms folded, the skin on my arms tingling for no identifiable reason. Then, I heard the front door open and close with soft precision. I remained motionless. Footsteps traversed the hallway, paused. A door opened, not mine, not yet. But I knew, with a certainty that nearly caused my knees to give way, that he was home, and that my desire for him was far from extinguished, not even remotely. The rain commenced just after midday, abrupt and forceful, drumming against the windows as if it had awaited the ideal moment. My husband had driven into town for an engagement. I watched his taillights vanish down the rain-slicked driveway, then pivoted back to the kitchen where he stood, his hair still damp from his shower, sleeves rolled up to his elbows, observing the tempest as if it held a message for him. We were scheduled to drive to the adjacent town, a hardware emporium there stocked the specific type of mesh my husband desired. He had left the list on the refrigerator, circled in red ink, his typical method when he wanted something executed his way without explicitly stating it. We didn't hurry, we allowed the downpour to decelerate our pace. I packed a pullover, just as a precaution. He drove for about half the distance when traffic came to a standstill, an accident, or perhaps localized flooding. The radio announced the road ahead was closed for an indefinite period. He glanced over at me, one hand still on the steering wheel. We could reverse course. I didn't respond. He looked out at the gray expanse of highway, then back at me. Or we could find a place to wait it out. The motel was situated just off the subsequent exit, aged brickwork, a flickering vacancy sign, a reception area that smelled of damp carpeting and scorched coffee. He presented his identification without a moment's pause. I stood beside him, arms crossed tightly, feeling the gravity of every unspoken decision. Only one room was unoccupied, 2 beds, 1 window, a television bolted to the dresser. It wasn't amorous, it wasn't clandestine, it was starkly real, excessively so. He dropped his bag on the chair and moved to the window, parting the curtain just enough to observe the rain lashing the pavement. "I used to enjoy weather like this," he remarked. "Made the world feel like it was on pause." I sat on the periphery of the bed, my fingers clenching the bedspread. "Paused," I reiterated. "That's precisely how it feels." He turned to regard me then, not as before, not with softness or tentativeness. There was something more incisive now, something resolute. "I don't want to merely be someone who passes through," he stated, "not in your existence." I felt my throat constrict. This wasn't intended to occur. I'm aware. But it did. He took a step nearer. "And I don't regret it." The silence between us thrummed. I rose to my feet without conscious intent. My hands were cold, but my chest was alight. He reached out, touching my face, not abruptly, not even with urgency, just with certainty. The kiss was entirely different from the first. It wasn't an inquiry, it was a declaration. It tasted of rain, of restraint finally broken. He drew me nearer, unhurriedly, as if he had awaited permission for this, as if he were no longer asking. I didn't prevent him, I had no desire to. Later, lying side by side on separate beds, fully clothed, we listened to the television's low hum in the background, some travel program with meaningless commentary filling the quiet. "I think about you constantly," he said, his gaze fixed on the ceiling. I didn't look at him, I feared that if I did, I wouldn't be able to look away. "I don't want this to conclude," I whispered. He didn't reply immediately. "Then, don't allow it to." I switched off the television and let the silence descend like a secondary covering. We didn't touch again, not that night. We didn't need to. My body still recalled everything, my skin still bore the impression of his hands. The tempest subsided by morning. We departed the motel without exchanging words, like unfamiliar individuals do. But in the vehicle, as he started the engine, he looked at me and said, "You don't have to feign anything when you're with me." And I comprehended that I hadn't feigned anything for days, not since the instant I saw him on that veranda, not since I wished for him to remain. The silence that ensued wasn't devoid of content, it was charged. It accompanied us, resided between the walls of the house like a reverberation no one else could perceive. We returned from the motel just around midday, the sun already high, puddles evaporating on the pavement. He transported the fencing materials to the garage as if nothing out of the ordinary had transpired, as if we hadn't crossed a boundary so deliberate, so conclusive, that nothing we uttered could reverse it. My husband was at home, occupied in the backyard. He greeted us with a smile, wiped his hands on his denim trousers, then looked back at the row of plants he was supporting with stakes. He inquired about the trip cursorily, and I responded too swiftly, stumbling over a partial untruth about road closures and a delayed delivery. He didn't appear to take notice, or perhaps he did and simply opted not to inquire further. That evening, something within him altered. He invited me to sit with him on the veranda, poured 2 glasses of wine, and spoke, not about chores or his timetable, but about us. He asked how I was sleeping, if I felt isolated, if I ever longed for how things once were. I answered cautiously, attempting to find the most innocuous words. I said I was fine, that I valued the predictability, that I was merely fatigued lately, nothing more. He reached for my hand across the table. It took me by surprise. His palm was rougher than I recalled, warm, familiar, but also distant in a manner that caused my chest to ache. His touch once ignited my skin, now it felt like the gesture of someone endeavoring to remember what intimacy formerly meant. That night, he retired to bed earlier than was his custom. He lay beside me in the dimness, one hand on my waist, his breath even against the nape of my neck. I stiffened, not because I was averse to it, but because I was unsure if I could offer myself to him with sincerity. I attempted. I turned towards him, allowed him to kiss me, permitted his hands to roam over me as they had years prior. But my body failed to react. I felt myself drifting somewhere beyond it, conscious of every instant yet disengaged from all sensation. I awaited something to stir within me, something warm, or primal, or simply human. But there was only quietude, not externally, but within my chest, a silent void where desire once resided. Afterwards, he kissed my shoulder and whispered that he loved me. I didn't reply, not because I didn't love him, but because I didn't know how to articulate it without falsehood. I went to the bathroom, turned the shower to cold, and stood beneath its spray long enough for my fingertips to become puckered. The water stunned my skin like an unanswerable query. I wrapped a towel around myself and stared into the looking glass, searching for a version of myself I still recognized. When I returned to the bedroom, he was asleep, one arm flung across my pillow. I slid under the bedclothes quietly, careful not to disturb him, and lay on my back, gazing into the darkness. I thought about the previous night, the way he had whispered, "You don't have to feign anything with me," how readily those words had taken root within me. And I wondered, not for the initial time, if the version of me that animated in his presence could ever revert to this existence, to this bed, to a man who touched my body but no longer connected with my soul. Sleep did not come without effort that night, it hadn't for weeks. But my yearning was no longer ill-defined or amorphous. It possessed a name, a voice, an aroma that clung to my skin long after I had washed it away, and a room across the hall that still held the faint trace of his exhalation. The notion for the dinner originated with my husband. He mentioned it offhandedly while sifting through the mail, as if it were merely another evening engagement, nothing extraordinary. "We should all dine together tomorrow. Something pleasant. I'll prepare the meal." His voice was light, cheerful. He even proposed grilling, though he seldom did so anymore. I consented too readily. I posed no inquiries, I didn't glance across the kitchen to where he stood, where the atmosphere already felt a degree more oppressive. He readied the meal with a quiet sense of accomplishment I hadn't observed in months. He trimmed the meat with exactitude, plucked rosemary from the garden, uncorked a bottle of wine he'd been reserving for a special occasion. I watched him move, and for a fleeting instant, I perceived the man I had wedded, competent, serene, focused. But it was akin to observing someone perform a role they hadn't practiced in years. He arrived shortly before 7. I was already attired, simple yet elegant, a dark green dress with a low-cut back and uncovered shoulders. Nothing ostentatious, just enough to feel as though the air might catch on my skin as I moved, enough to feel desired, even if only by my own mirrored image. When he came in, his eyes met mine at once. There was no hesitation, no prolonged gaze, but something unvoiced passed between us in the stillness of that acknowledgement. My husband poured beverages, engaged in small talk. He presented the food as if it were a festivity. "Feels like bygone days," he remarked, raising his glass. We touched glasses, smiled, chewed. But beneath the table, my knees quivered. Every motion felt excessively choreographed, every silence too laden with unspoken meaning. I was conscious of every inch separating our chairs, of the way his leg shifted almost imperceptibly toward mine when he leaned forward to reach for the salt. The conversation meandered. My husband recalled childhood holidays, narrated tales about the lakeside cottage, fishing tackle, muddy footwear. The young man nodded civilly, offered brief remarks, but spoke little. His focus was fragmented, cautious. "You've become rather quiet," my husband quipped at one point, aiming the comment at me. "Just taking it all in," I replied, taking a sip of wine I didn't register. After the meal, he excused himself to make a telephone call, something concerning the office, a modification in the schedule. I began to remove the plates, arranging them with excessive neatness, pretending the cadence of dish and glass would soothe me. He followed me into the kitchen without uttering a word. For a moment, we stood in silence, the weight of the household pressing in on us. He reached for a plate, our hands made contact. I didn't withdraw. "I don't know how much longer I can pretend I don't desire you," he whispered, his voice barely a murmur. I turned to face him then. "Then don't." He let out a breath as if he'd been holding it for ages. Footsteps approached from the veranda, my husband's voice sounding light, ordinary. We separated in one fluid movement, as though nothing had transpired. But something had. Later, after everything was tidied and still, I sat alone on the edge of my bed, observing the moonlight on the floor. I could still feel his fingers against mine, still hear the tremor in his voice, still taste the moment we almost didn't hold back. I contemplated how perilously close we were to being discovered, and how little I had cared, not truly. Because what filled me with more dread than being found out was the notion of never experiencing his skin against mine again, never hearing that voice utter my name with significance. The true infidelity wasn't in our actions, it was in what I craved next. It was merely a slip of paper, torn from the margin of an old writing pad, the corners slightly bent. I never intended for him to discover it, it wasn't even meant to be kept. But an inner part of me needed to articulate it, needed to see the words existing outside myself, where they could be free of shame or justification. I penned it late one night, alone in the kitchen, the clocks ticking amplified in the quiet. The message wasn't lengthy, it wasn't lyrical. It was straightforward, direct, a confession in unadorned terms, not about what had occurred, but about my feelings, the way my body had reawakened, the way his presence had shattered a stillness I hadn't even been aware had taken root in my very being. I wrote that I was uncertain of what I desired, only that I hadn't felt like a woman in years until he regarded me as one. I folded the sheet meticulously and inserted it between the pages of a book on my bedside table, a novel I hadn't picked up in months. I didn't intend to give it to him, I wasn't that incautious. But perhaps a fragment of me wished for it to be found. And it was. I realized it was gone 2 days later. The book had been shifted, the letter absent. There was no direct confrontation, no uncomfortable instant, just a piece of paper tucked under my pillow that evening. His script, neat, intentional, I experience it too. I am not bewildered. I am not regretful. And I am not departing unless you request me to. I lay on the bed with that note resting on my chest, its weight more substantial than anything I had worn in years. I read it 3 times before slipping it into the pocket of my coat. I couldn't discard it, I couldn't risk leaving it in plain sight, but I had to have it with me. That afternoon, I prepared tea. I moved about the house as usual, folded laundry, watered plants, but every action possessed a new significance. Every contact with fabric, every brush of a leaf felt intensified. I saw my reflection in the hallway mirror and observed someone I didn't entirely recognize, a woman who was concealing something, yes, but also radiating a quiet luminescence from somewhere deep within. He found me in the garden just before dusk. My husband had gone into town again, another task, another hour of absence that neither of us acknowledged for what it truly represented. He said nothing, merely walked to where I was kneeling, my gloves coated in moist earth. I stood, brushing soil from my hands, struggling to prevent myself from reaching for him. "You provided me with an answer," I said. He nodded. I meant every single word. I watched him for a long moment. The breeze stirred the hair at his temple. He appeared weary, yet vibrant, hungry in the same way I felt internally. "I don't know how to navigate this," I confessed. He stepped closer. "Then don't attempt to comprehend it all at once." We didn't make contact, not then, not yet. The air between us held enough strain to fracture the heavens. I went back indoors and opened my drawer, retrieving a piece of lingerie I hadn't worn in years, soft, ivory lace, the kind that barely maintained its form, more insinuation than actuality. I didn't put it on for anyone that night. I didn't light candles or scrutinize myself in the mirror. I simply held it in my hands. And I knew I was already further lost than I had ever intended to be, because desiring him no longer felt like a matter of choice, it felt like the sole truth I possessed. The station was more diminutive than I recalled, merely 2 sets of rails, a weathered seat, and a vending machine with erratically blinking lights, the sort of location where individuals didn't tarry, where departures were intended to be swift and easily forgotten. Yet I stood there longer than necessary, my coat clutched firmly at the neck, the wind plucking at the hem of my attire as if to whisk me away to some other place. He had informed me 2 days prior that he was departing, just for a brief period, a short excursion before the new academic term commenced, nothing momentous, nothing conclusive. He uttered it as though it held no significance, but I detected it in his tone, a reluctance, a constraint, the silent wish that I would implore him to remain. I didn't. I offered no words at all. I nodded and turned away, then passed the night in bed, staring at the ceiling, attempting to feign that I still understood who I was. But when daylight arrived, I dressed without conscious thought, not for my husband, not for the day ahead, but for him, a soft blouse tucked into a skirt that flowed with my movements, low-heeled shoes that clicked on the driveway as I ventured outside. I told my husband I was headed to the market. I didn't even pause to hear his reply. He was already on the platform when I got there, one hand gripping the strap of his bag, the other in his pocket. He wasn't pacing, he stood motionless, as if he anticipated my arrival, as if he had been certain all along. Our eyes connected, and I felt my breath hitch, not from anxiety, not even from sorrow, but from the sheer solace of seeing him one final time without artifice. I didn't expect you to be here, he said softly. I told myself I wouldn't come. He smiled, the kind that inflicted a pang. Yet, here you are. I nodded. Here I am. We didn't touch, we didn't venture to. There were others nearby, an elderly pair, a youth with earphones, a man tapping on his phone. But it wasn't the presence of others that kept us apart, it was something more profound. We had already conveyed more through our silences than words could ever express. I'm returning, he stated. I'm aware. Will you be here? I don't know who I will be when you get back. He regarded me then, not with sadness or hope, but with something gentler, comprehension, perhaps even serenity. Whatever transformations occur, don't let this fade, he said, extracting a small, folded note from his coat pocket and placing it in my hand. Don't forget what it felt like to be truly perceived. The train drew near, a low vibration escalating into a roar. He stepped back, gave a single nod, and boarded without another utterance. I didn't unfold the note immediately. I waited until I was back in my car, fingers unsteady, heart overflowing. Inside was just one sentence: you instilled bravery in me. I hope I did likewise for you. I remained there until the platform was deserted, until the clouds amassed and the sky looked ready to weep. Then I drove homeward, slowly, intentionally, knowing that while nothing appeared different, everything had irrevocably changed. My husband met me at the door with a preoccupied smile, inquired about the market. I said it was bustling. I kissed his cheek. I hung up my coat. That night, I stood before the mirror, clad in nothing but the ivory lace I had once merely held. I didn't contemplate right or wrong, I didn't dwell on culpability. I thought about craving, about breath, about what it signifies to be alive and claimed and utterly undone. And though he was gone, I knew I would never revert to the woman I was before him. Because once you have been genuinely seen, you cannot return to being invisible, not even for the sake of love.